January 2021. Prior to joining the EPA, he held senior leadership positions at the University of Western Australia as Pro-Vice-Chancellor and Executive Dean of the Faculty of Arts, Business, Law and Education, and was previously head of the School of Earth and Environment in the Faculty of Science. He's held board positions across diverse sectors including environmental management, business, international education and regional development. Matthew's areas of expertise relate to environmental geography, land management, regional development and spatial planning. He's worked closely with Commonwealth, state and local government, as well as not-for-profits and the private sector on issues relating to regional development, land use assessment, urban development and environmental management. He's also worked on a range of projects in collaboration with partners in Africa, North America, Europe and Southeast Asia. Matthew has a PhD in Geography from Curtin University and a BA in Geography and Environmental Management from Edith Cowan University. And in 2020 he was elected as a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia. So I'm going to put Matthew's presentation on, and I'm going to trust that that he can ad-lib for the minute that it takes me.
The bit that Christine didn't mention is that we worked together for 20 years at the University of Western Australia. Christine was the sort of general manager, executive manager of the Faculty of Science, and so we got to work on a lot of great stuff together, and a lot of that related to matters associated with environmental science, environmental protection, land use and so on. And it was a terrific environment that we had with some of the best researchers in the world focused on questions around ecology, geomorphology, land use and so forth. Absolutely wonderful environment. And I left the university and joined the EPA, and lo and behold found that Christine had landed into this role, and so it's really lovely to be back together working on things collaboratively. And it was really great that I was asked to come along to this afternoon. I think one of the really important things that the EPA needs to do is to be always engaged with industry, across government and across the community as well. And I, for one, am a huge beneficiary of your your work. Just in the little neighbourhood that I live in, there are at least 2 or 3 friends groups that are very active, and the work that they do is just fantastic. And I have to say thank you, because you do amazing work in terms of improving environmental amenity in the environments that we live in. So thank you just for my little neighbourhood, and I'm sure across the whole metropolitan area. So today I was asked to sort of come along and give a little bit of an overview of a number of things, and one is what the EPA is, and I think equally important is what the EPA isn't. So sort of try and balance those two things out and give you an understanding of what we are and what we do. The second thing is to talk a little bit about kind of the key parts of the Environmental Protection Act that we sort of have some responsibility for. I think Tim has covered part 5 in particular, Tim, and some other aspects, but I'll focus in on part 4 especially, and then I'll talk a little bit about the things that are particularly helpful to me in my role and to my colleagues on the EPA in terms of public submission. So what does a really good public submission look like? How are they most helpful? How do we use them and so forth?
So this clicker actually does work.
Oh, great. Yeah. So 3 themes. I'll start, as I said, talking a little bit about what the EPA is, what it isn't, the assessment process, and then I'll finish off with a little bit about public submissions. So the Environmental Protection Authority has a long history, more than 50 years old. It was created under an old 1971 Act, and then that was updated, and the Act was completely rewritten really in 1986, but the EPA continued on. So it's got a long history of playing a role in Western Australia in terms of environmental protection. The objectives of the authority are really pretty simple actually. To use our best endeavours to protect the environment of Western Australia and to prevent, control and abate pollution and environmental harm. So I sort of think of those as kind of the key things that we're here to do. That's our core focus, I suppose. A lot of people are surprised when I tell them it actually only consists of 5 people. 5 people, only one of whom is full-time, the rest are part-time. So effectively it's not a department. A lot of people think it's a great big department with hundreds of staff working for it and so on. It's just a little group of 5 of us supported by a department, and I'll come to that in just a moment. But we do have, under the Act, a really broad and interesting set of functions. And if I was to offer a little bit of self-reflection and critique of the EPA, I think that it's probably zeroed in a little bit too much over the past 30 years or so, and particularly perhaps the last 15, on just one of about 17 core functions that it has, and that's the function around environmental impact assessment. The functions that we have responsibility for are really broad and include things like community engagement. They include encouraging research and studies, education, public advice, as Tim said, strategic advice to the Minister. So there's a whole bunch of things there that the EPA has within its broader functions, all five of us. A key piece of the EPA, a real hallmark of the EPA, and I've sort of really discovered how important this is perhaps over the last couple of years, is independence. And the Act says something to the effect of the EPA Chair will not take direction from the Minister and that the EPA will not take direction from the Minister. And it is an incredibly liberating position to be in that I don't take a phone call from the Minister to say, hey Matthew, we need to get this particular outcome. I don't take a phone call from the department to say, hey, this is the outcome we'd expect. That space is actually really welcomed. And of course, not all similar agencies or authorities have that benefit. So it's a really important hallmark of the EPA. But it's probably fair to say we operate with the broad sort of characteristics of a public sector board. So we don't have staff. There is a department with staff who provide us with services. I don't have line management over a department or staff. I work sort of in a collegial space with 5 other members on a board. So if I was to sort of characterise that visually, we have the EPA providing advice to the Minister. I'll come back to that in just a moment. And our services, the advice, the scientific works, the assessments, the strategic sort of advice and so forth is all provided by the Department of Water and Environmental Regulation. So they're our service provider. It's a little bit like the West Australian Planning Commission receiving its services from the Department of Planning, Lands and Heritage, so similar sort of an arrangement. Importantly, you could probably view the Department of Water and Environmental Regulation as sort of the hub of a network because we then draw on expertise from DBCA, from DEMERS, from other government agencies, from the higher education sector, research sector and so forth as well. But DWER is our prominent supporter, I suppose. So that's sort of the broad structure. Now, it is also worth perhaps just emphasising that little piece in there, advice to the Minister. So the EPA doesn't make final decisions on projects. We make recommendations to the Minister and then the Minister makes the final decisions, or government makes final decisions. We do make decisions along the way, but we don't make final decisions. I'll come back to that in just a moment. So just turning to the focus of today and the EPA and urban bushland, and I suppose that what I'm going to say applies not just to urban bushland but to any of our activities. I think broadly you could characterise what we do in 2 different ways. One is sort of the strategic or the proactive, and then the other is a more reactive, responsive sort of a process. So the proactive and strategic is things like strategic advice to the Minister. So Tim mentioned, for example, the piece on Exmouth Gulf that we released late last year. So that piece of work was done over the course of about 12 months, and it was looking at the environmental values and status and pressures on Exmouth Gulf. And it had a series of recommendations in there to the Minister, and those included the creation of a national park on the eastern part of the Gulf, Class A status for a number of the islands and a couple of sites on shore, a broad management committee and so forth. And so the Minister then takes that strategic advice and then acted on it to implement most of those things. And there's a long history of providing strategic advice from the EPA. There's also broader public advice on a range of different environmental matters, formal guidance, so that's formal guidance to decision makers, to planners, to developers, to engineers and so forth, which might be about things like better urban design, about native vegetation protection in the urban development process. It could be on guidance for measurement of subterranean fauna or analysis of subterranean fauna or vegetation surveys and so forth. So things that are really about, I suppose, getting ahead of development and trying to give guidance to industry developers and so forth around those things. And then the last here is really engagement. So coming along to an event like this and trying to explain what the EPA does, explaining some of the key issues we're trying to grapple with and so forth. The second bit is the bit is the tough bit, and that's the responsive bit. That's where proponents are dreaming up significant proposals, for infrastructure, land development, mining, oil and gas and so forth, and the EPA undertakes assessments of those. The EPA also undertakes assessment of planning schemes as well. So the other side of this is the assessment of schemes. It's not something I'll dwell on today. You probably have a whole section on schemes alone, and probably the intersection between the Environmental Protection Act and various aspects of the planning system are also well worth spending some time on as well. So I think we kind of do two things. One is we're sort of in the proactive space, the strategic space, but also in that responsive space. And if I was critical, as I said, of the EPA over the past 15 or 20 years, I think it's probably too much in that responsive Part 4 of the Act dealing with assessments, and needs to be a little bit more active in the proactive strategic environmental protection space. You can find a whole suite of stuff on our website. There's everything on there from all of our, most of our old strategic advice, at least for the last 15 or 20 years. There's guidances on various environmental matters. There's all of the assessment reports. There's a consultation hub for open consultations and so forth. So I'd encourage you to go in there and have a bit of a look around for some of the things I'm going to talk about over the next little while. So maybe I'll start with the strategic stuff. The strategic stuff, I think, is some of the really most interesting things that the EPA has been involved with over its history. The document on the left, I think, is a watershed document in some respects, and many of you will remember the work that was done around System 6 in particular, and all of the systems across Australia, across Western Australia. And that work emerged in the 1970s through the Conservation Through Reserves Committee. It did amazing work, basically root and branch, going through just about every site that was potentially available for a reserve and sort of describing it, characterising it, and making some recommendation about its future. And System 6, I think, is particularly impressive because it takes all of the complexity around the Swan Coastal Plain, parts of the Jarrah Forest and through into sort of the parts of the southwest as well, and begins to sort of build a biophysical picture of the environmental characteristics of that area, but also goes through and does a very, very careful assessment of the reserve potential, if you like, for particular areas, and makes a series of recommendations around the reserve system. And it really formed the basis of the reserve system that we see today across most of the Swan Coastal Plain. And elsewhere. Tim talked about 16E advice. My own view, and many of you will be familiar with the SAPA, is I wonder whether there's actually a really important opportunity to revisit the System 6 work. I think to look at the current status of reserves, but also to look at what is the potential for future reserves. And if I think about Bush Forever, and some of the amazing values that are sort of locked up in Bush Forever, is there not a really important opportunity to revisit some of this work? So that's a discussion I'm just starting to have with my colleagues on the EPA about saying, well, if SAPA is kind of stalled, then maybe the EPA needs to step into the void and do some work around this and get back into this forward-thinking strategic place. Perth and Peel at 3.5 is a kind of a similar example. That was a piece that was done in anticipation of the SAPA. It's a really, really good document. It's pretty high level. It offers some really good observations around environmental stresses, environmental pressures, I guess, and environmental issues. It's a bit eye-watering in places to read. I mean, you really begin to get a good sense of the stress that the Swan Coastal Plain is under. Excellent, thank you, Mary. And I think most people would agree, a really good document. It I think, would be a really interesting opportunity to merge the sort of work that was done in the System 6 studies with that sort of document and begin to come up with something a little bit more comprehensive in terms of a plan. So as I said, very early days, but certainly a conversation the EPA is beginning to open up internally. So that's probably just a little sneak peek, I suppose, into our strategic plan. The other things I guess that we do in that more sort of forward-thinking strategic space is our guidances. So the left here, for example, guidance for planning and development for the protection of naturally vegetated areas in urban and peri-urban areas. So, it's really saying to developers, here's what the EPA's sort of expectations are. I think there's probably a question about whether we go far enough there, and I think that that's an interesting sort of a question that we'll probably need to open up again at some point. But nevertheless, it's an example of the sort of the work that we do to try and get in front of development. And then on the right there is the study we just released a few weeks ago on Brixton Street wetlands. It's perhaps worth my while just sort of stopping and talking about how that came to light. Without raising expectations, perhaps. I need to be a little bit careful. We had a couple of delegations from the Biliard group of concerned scientists, really useful and productive discussions who put to us a number of significant environmental issues. And in our first meeting, the difficulty with some of the things I was hearing from that group was it covered everything. It was just impossible for us to figure out, well, what exactly is the priority here? There's, 15 things on the list. But a follow-up meeting to that was very, very good, and it basically put this issue on the table, and it meant that we could really focus our mind, because of course we get lots and lots of groups come and say this is the most important thing in the whole state that you need to be focused on. But the BLR group did a great job, I think, of coming along and sort of explaining why this was important. And Hans Lambers, who many of you will know, was kind of instrumental. So I did a bit of follow-up with Hans, and I think I did at least 2 or 3 visits out to that area with him and colleagues to better understand what was going on. It was very clear from both those visits plus our own studies and inquiries that here was an area that was globally unique, could not be represented by other ecosystems. It was, by definition, its own thing. It was absolutely unique, incredibly special. But what was also really front of mind for us was that it was under enormous pressure as well. So a number of significant developments right up against that very, very small system. But the other thing that was apparent to us was that it had a weak conservation status, so highly fragmented tenure arrangements across the site, a lack of coordinated management and so forth. So really from that and being given that degree of focus, we were able to then say, look, we do need to say something about this site and we do need to sort of push the envelope on it, and that led to that particular study. So as I said, we get lots and lots of people coming to us and saying that this particular issue is really important, you should focus on it and so on, but you can imagine we get hundreds of those. And I guess the thing that might be really useful for the Urban Bushland Council to contemplate is to say, what are your top 3 or 4? What are the things that you really, really need to focus on that are really, really special? And then, we can begin to have a conversation about those things. So anyway, there's just a little sort of a story, I suppose, about how that piece of work came to light, but importantly how a group is able to bring forward an idea or a priority and to be able to get something enacted. Then there's the really difficult bits, and these are the bits that that probably cause me the most anxiety and stress, and that's the environmental assessments. So these are of significant proposals on Swan Coastal Plain, in the Pilbara, southwest and so forth, where we have to do assessments of major projects and try and consider the environmental effects of those to make a recommendation to the minister through a process which I'll describe in a moment, with a set of conditions if we recommend that the project should proceed. And they're often the really difficult ones because, and by definition they're difficult because they include things like land clearing, they include changes to hydrological systems, they can include changes to coastal waters, to benthic habitats and communities and so forth. So they're often really, really difficult for us. So I'll just spend a little bit of time talking about assessments. And I looked across our suite of documents the other day and thought to myself, if I had no idea what the environmental impact assessment process looked like and what the EPA did, I would be utterly confused from all the stuff that we have on our website. So it's an urgent piece of work that we need to do, which is to turn some stuff into plain language. So you'll find on our website a really complex and detailed procedure suite that talks about all of the things that we do in an assessment. And I'm going to try and strip that right down to the bare bones. So Tim and Hugh will probably have a field day with this because I'm going to actually take a whole bunch of the complexity out of the story and to say, these are the kind of the key steps and this is where you might engage. So a lot of the nuance and complexity will sort of be lost, but I'll try and simplify it as best I can. So part 4 of the Act establishes the environmental impact assessment process effectively. It outlines the way in which that occurs in very, very broad terms. But in order to operationalise that, in order to make it work, the EPA establishes a process for those assessments and a suite of documents to support them, and that's guidance for proponents, but also for the community, across government and so forth. And as I said, looking at those documents, horrendously complex. The key document there is probably the procedures manual, but a very, very detailed manual. The one there that I've put 2 asterisks against are the Statement of Environmental Principles, Factors and Objectives. And maybe for the Urban Bushland Council and for friends groups, this is really important because it is actually a fairly simple document, and it's into different environmental factors. It talks about how we think about significance. It talks about the role of EIA and so forth. So a fairly straightforward document, and it's quite important or quite useful when it comes to submissions later on. So I don't know whether you might cover that. Mary, maybe you'll be talking about that a little bit later when you talk about submissions. Oh, you've got, okay, they're out there. That's great, thank you. So I think that's a really, really valuable document just in terms of just understanding how the EPA frames matters. There are also more detailed environmental factor guidelines. That's around things like coastal waters, greenhouse gas, and so forth. Okay, so they take things into a little bit more detail. So you've already got this, so I don't think I'll dwell on it, but this is sort of how we break up the environment. So sea, land, water, air and people, and then in there are a set of subsets, and then there are some specific objectives. So I haven't got my glasses on, but if I just try and read marine fauna for argument's sake, the broad objective is to protect marine fauna so that biological diversity and ecological integrity are maintained. So when we do an assessment, we kind of have that front of mind. What is the objective for marine fauna? What is the objective for greenhouse gas? Or what is the objective for inland waters and so forth? So, as I said, I'm just going to walk you through a stripped-down version of the process, at least as I think most people probably experience it. So typically what would happen before any proposal sees the light of day is that there would be a pre-referral meeting, sometimes with me and sometimes with members of the department, with a proponent. So a proponent would come in and say, I've got this idea to do X, Y and Z, and it's going to probably have these environmental effects. And usually at that point you sort of think to yourself, gee, this is a real horror show here. It doesn't look too good from an environmental perspective, so we have a real discussion about what the project might need to look like. And a key part of that is ensuring, A, that we have the right information, so making sure that we have everything that we need to be able to have a sensible discussion about the project. But a key thing we're always focused on is the mitigation hierarchy. And I guess the rule of thumb is the best impact is the one you never had, right? The one that you never had in the first place. So that's talking to a proponent about saying things like, how would you reconsider this proposal with less clearing? How would you reconsider this proposal with less discharge down a river? How would you consider this proposal with a reduced impact on benthic habitats? So it's all about trying to make sure that the project at the very outset, the first bit that people think about is avoidance. So get as many issues off the table as possible. And if you can't avoid them, then to ask proponents the hard question about minimisation. How do you make sure that you're minimising that impact? How can we be absolutely confident that you've done all you can to reduce your effect? Later on, we probably have a discussion about rehabilitation and we have a discussion about offsets. The thing we put to proponents consistently is that offsets are a last resort. The first thing you should be doing is avoiding and minimising your impacts. Don't have an impact if you can, and offsets are a last resort. I think sometimes proponents view offsets a little differently. I think sometimes proponents see offsets as the ticket to get an approval. So, I'll have a development over here, but what I'll do is I'll go and I'll invest in an offsets package over here and she'll be right. But the problem is you've still lost this, So it's a really key concern for us is that offsets are a last resort. So the first discussion is really a pre-referral meeting to straighten the proponent up, get them thinking about the things that will matter, trying to understand what the issue is. And sometimes poor projects fall away. They never see the light of day because a process like this sort of filters them out in effect. The next step is the referral process. How does a referral make its way to the EPA? The most common mechanism is a proponent just self-refers. They bring their project in formally and they say, okay, this is what we've got. This is what we're planning to do. Here are its dimensions, its geographic footprint, the kind of the key elements of it, and physical elements and operational elements and so forth. But projects can be referred by others as well. They can be referred by third parties. So you might see a project that's occurring in your area and you go, oh, hold on, I don't think that's been properly assessed. Well, you have the power as a member of the community to refer that in. Similarly, the EPA can call in a project if we think that there's something out there that's occurring. That can be called in and we can begin the process of deciding whether it's a valid proposal or try to work out what the proposal even looks like in the first place and then take it from there. The minister can refer it in, a decision-making authority can refer a project in and so forth. But the two most common and probably the most common is the proponent self-refers or third parties referring. The EPA then has to consider whether the referral is valid. So, is the referral, does it actually, does it provide all of the key information that we need? Has it already been referred in the past? Has it already been assessed? Has part of it been assessed? Is it under assessment? So there's quite a bit of work to be done to try and figure out if an assessment is valid for all of those reasons. The key thing, and I've just underlined this because I'll come back to all of these, is the EPA's 7-day comment period. So once we've determined that a proposal is valid, we'll then release it for 7 days of public comment. And I'll come back to what is really helpful to me when those proposals are released for that 7-day comment period. But on the basis of comments and other inquiries that we make ourselves, the EPA then considers if there's any more information that we still need. So the 7-day comment period is really useful at putting information on the table that helps me and the officers to ask more questions of a proposal. And sometimes that'll mean going back to the proponent and trying to get more information out of them about what their proposal looks like if we think that there's been something that's been missed. So once we've been out for our 7-day public comment period, we then sort of may have to make a decision about, well, should this thing be assessed or shouldn't it, whatever that proposal might be. So this is sort of what it looks like from the inside, I guess. From the inside, what happens is the department provides me with a package. That package includes a briefing note that describes what's going on in the proposal. It includes the referral itself, and then it includes all of your comments. So I get every comment. I don't get a summary of the comments. I get the actual comment. So I get to engage with the whole lot. And that then opens up a dialogue with the department to say, well, have we adequately considered these particular matters? Have we really got a full feeling for what this proposal looks like? It's actually quite a productive process. So all of your comments are read and engaged with. So really important to sort of know that. And we're trying to make a judgment call here, a judgment call about whether something should be assessed or not. And a key kind of filter that we're putting across things is the matter of significance. And significance, I think you must have it probably there in that document that's been handed out. But the sort of things that we're really interested in is what are the environmental values? What is the sensitivity of that particular area? What's the quality of that environment? Is it highly degraded or is it in outstanding condition? How big is this project? Is it enormous in terms of its geographic footprint? Does it last for 30 years, 80 years or 100 years, or is it just a short 5-year burst? What is the magnitude of the impacts? For example, if we had a mine site that was engaged in groundwater dewatering of groundwater systems, what's the level of discharge down, say, a river system or a stream or into a catchment? So we're trying to understand what the magnitude of that looks like. There's a whole range of things there that we're trying to understand. Do we have some confidence that there might be an ability to mitigate or manage matters? And I guess something that is really, I think, particularly relevant to Bushland Council is cumulative effects. So if you've got a particular area where you've already had significant environmental impacts, and we're going to see yet more clearing, we're going to see yet more destruction of habitat, for example, in an area that's already received considerable change, how do we begin to think about what that cumulative effect looks like, and at what point is enough enough? At what point do we reach a kind of a threshold where we say actually the cumulative effects on this particular vegetation type or habitat and so forth is enough? Holistic effects really refers to interactions between effects. It's sort of when you break the environment into its various bits, we can look at the cumulative effects, and when we try to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, how do all of those various components interact with each other? And we're always interested in what's the level of public interest in this. Now, that is not really a determinant of significance. I think the environmental values are kind of the predominant determinant of significance. But public interest is important because what it does is it gives us insight, I suppose, into it provides local knowledge, local context, local understanding of the environmental significance. Okay, really important, and I'll come back to that. And the other thing that we're always interested in is, well, what also is the role of other regulators? Might this be something that can be regulated through Part 5 of the Environmental Protection Act? Might there be other mechanisms to regulate a particular proposal where the EPA doesn't need to step into the space? And you've got to appreciate that's important, because if the EPA stepped into the space of every single proposal, then we simply couldn't do our job. So we must focus on some of the big, gnarly, nasty projects with significant environmental effects, where there are multiple factors that are affected, and in particular where there is no other regulator who might adequately be able to address matters to our objectives, and you've got those objectives in that document. So then there's the question of, well, do we decide to assess or not? So I get the package and I've got to sort of work with the officers to decide, okay, are we going to assess this? And if we're going to assess it, then what level is the assessment? And there are sort of broadly 4 levels of assessment. And I kind of don't like the term levels of assessment. It really does imply a hierarchy, and I don't think that's always that helpful. The first is assessment with the information that the proponent has provided. Some proponents have a very simple project where they put all of the information on the table and you can just proceed to an assessment. You can get it done fairly quickly. Sometimes there are matters that are referred in, and then the public comment period makes me go, oh, hold on, I think we need to know a little bit more about, it might be vegetation clearing, it might be about coastal processes, it might be something else. So we have to go back and say to the proponent, we need more information. We can't proceed with the assessment until we have that. The third thing then is assessment with the information that's provided, but with a public review period. Sometimes 2 weeks, sometimes 4 weeks, could probably go out to 6 weeks, but 4 weeks sort of typically is about where we're at, 2 to 4 weeks. These are for projects where there might be 2 or 3 environmental factors involved, maybe 4 fairly contained sort of projects. Environmental reviews, I've not seen an environmental review yet with no public input, so I don't know on what circumstances we would use them, so I've not certainly agreed to any in my couple of years in the role. The last one there is the public environmental review. So public environmental review, most of you will be familiar with, is the really big complex projects with multiple factors, lots of complexity, lots of uncertainty associated with them. So I've just underlined there that, the 2 kind of key moments at which we're looking for public input. So assessment on the referral information where there's a public period, for comment, and then the public environmental reviews. And then we get into the assessment, and the assessment is often a very long process, as many of you will be familiar with. It can be 6 months, but it could go up to a couple of years quite easily. It involves scoping and environmental studies. In some cases, not many, there's a review of environmental scoping documents. Environmental scoping documents are really kind of like an outline of all of the studies that need to be undertaken. So the most recent I can think of on this was the fracking proposal, Black Mountain. I think that was the most recent one that we went out to comment on. And we went out to comment on that one because obviously very high level of public interest, very technical studies required, lots of need, I felt, for good community input right the way through the process. So there needed to be a strong engagement in that one. Along the way, there might be amendments to projects. Sometimes these are beneficial. The proponent might reduce the development envelope, they might reduce the amount of clearing or dewatering or whatever the effect might be. So there's often quite a lot of discussion about a project with a proponent as the assessment unfolds. And it's always, as I said, focused on that mitigation hierarchy. You know, where can you make this project smaller? Where can you avoid an impact? Where can you minimise it and so forth? So it seems to me that projects that come in the door will often look like this, but by the end, you know, they look quite different. So there are a number of amendments that reshape those projects over time. Proponents are then required to prepare an environmental review document, and then typically in a case of an ARI with a public review process and a PR, you get to read that document and provide us with feedback. Just going on, the EPA report and recommended conditions. So we prepare a report once all the materials are in front of us, once we're satisfied that the proponent has responded adequately to public submissions, and that we have all that we're required to prepare a reasonable assessment report. So we prepare our assessment report with recommended conditions. And as I emphasised a moment ago, this is all a recommendation to the Minister. Okay, so we recommend to the Minister, we don't make the final decision. And the last bit I wanted to just emphasise is there is a public appeals process. So while there's public engagement in the EPA process right the way through our body of work, there's also at the end of all of that the ability to appeal an EPA report. And that too is a really important one, a really important process to engage in. People sometimes say to me, well, you know, you can't be that happy that you got so many appeals. I was thinking you hear about Northwest Shelf, you know, you've got 780 appeals, you know, and those appeals are great because what they do is they provide really important information on the project, but they help us ask more detailed questions. And they also help us improve our assessments into the future. So in my mind, the appeals process is not something to be feared. It's sort of something that is about continually improving your environmental standards, improving the way in which you engage in projects and understand them and understand those environmental impacts. So it's not, in my mind, it's not a defensive process, it's a very, very healthy one, and one to be welcomed. And so we get a lot of good stuff out of those appeals, but a really important one to bear in mind in terms of the entire chain of events, I suppose, and opportunities for you to engage in the process. So the final decision, as I said, is a ministerial decision. After the wash-up of an appeals process, the Minister will consult with other decision-making authorities, and there'll be the issuing of a ministerial statement to a proponent, which is sort of like the rules of what they can and they can't do. And then the EPA is sort of done at this point, and it falls into DWER's environmental enforcement and compliance area. There's other things associated with post-assessment and so forth, but I think it's probably just easier to leave it at that and sort of say this is kind of what the process looks like. And as I said, I've left out lots of nuance, lots of complexity and so forth, but that kind of gives you an overview of it. So maybe from the perspective of Urban Bushland Council and particularly friends groups, it's worthwhile thinking about what makes for a really effective or a really helpful submission. The first thing is to know, well, where on earth do you find out about these projects? Well, the first thing is to have a look on our website at the Consultation Hub, and you can sign up to alerts and so forth so you can find out about projects. But Consultation Hub has basically everything up there that we're consulting on. So let's start with the 7-day comment period. So EPA has decided that we've got all the information we need, that the referral is valid, and so we publish it on our website and it's there for 7 days comment. People say 7 days is not enough, and it probably isn't. And it's certainly something that we need to sort of work through. But this is what I need help with, right? This is where you can help me, because in the end I see all of your comments and I use them for the dialogue, both with the department but also with the proponent. The first thing I'm trying to figure out is whether this thing should be assessed or not. Whatever this proposal is, does it need to be assessed, or is there another way that this could be managed that's not in Part 4, that's through some other form of regulation? And if we're to assess it, at what level? So they're the sort of the two key questions that I can really use help from the broader community on. So how can you best help me with that? The first thing is your submissions at this point need not be long. A page, half a page, a paragraph is fine. So we get all sorts of things come in with this, with this 7-day comment period, and some of them are very, very helpful and some of them are less so. The sort of things that are less so is simply statements that I don't like the project. You know, a one-liner, this is no good. Well, it doesn't really kind of help me. I don't know there's nothing new on the table. Many projects are not popular. We don't like them for a whole range of reasons. But what's really useful to me is if you can just go a little bit further. So what are the specific environmental matters that you're concerned about? Is it vegetation clearing? Is it loss of habitat? Is it a change to coastal processes? What exactly is it? Is it air emissions? So just give me something specific there. But the second thing, and this is where I think friends groups are really, really important, and in fact, not just friends group, any group, natural resource management groups, land care type groups and so forth, is what you all have is local knowledge that the proponent often doesn't have, that the EPA, with just the 5 of us, certainly doesn't always have, and that the department can't always bear across. But you know your patches extremely well. And you will have done things like vegetation surveys, but you'll have also done close observation of those places, often for decades. So you'll know what species might be present, what fauna species visit that particular place, what's present and what's not. You'll have some good understanding of what's going on in your patch. So it's really helpful to me if you can say something about that. What local knowledge can you provide to say, look, these particular species are on this site or in this area and are really important, and it is really important that they are considered in the context of an assessment. So tell me something about the sort of the environmental values. What's there? What conditions is it in? If it's outstanding, make sure you tell me that, because I can't just believe the proponent. I've got, this is the whole point of this, is that you can also tell me what's really of value and what's its condition. The other thing is to briefly say something, if you can, about any gaps or shortcomings that you might be aware of in the proposal. So none of that need be long, and you'll all have very, very different levels of information and insight and so forth, and all you need to do is put on the table what you can, because if you're concerned about a project, there's a good chance that there's a number of other people who are as well, and if I can get those quality of submissions come across my desk and I can engage with them, then I've got a better chance of being able to ask the right questions of the department and the proponent. So local knowledge is really, really important in this process. So all of that, as I said, comes together and helps me to make a kind of decision about, yes, we should assess this, yes, we should assess it at this particular level, or no, actually, there's been no submissions, or the 1 or 2 submissions have actually not raised things that the EPA can deal with, or there are other regulators who can adequately deal with the issues. So it's useful to sort of be able to think about it in those terms. We get campaigns a lot, of course, as you would expect. Campaigns can be very effective, but they can actually be of very modest value as well. Where I find it quite useful in terms of a number of submissions coming in is CCWA do this quite well, actually. So CCWA, where they'll have their writing workshops and so forth, and you'll sort of collectively think about the things that concern you, but I don't just get a whole pile of exactly the same thing. Yeah, there might be some things where you borrowed some paragraphs off each other and so forth, and that's absolutely fine. But they're actually quite useful because I know that you've engaged with the question, you've come together as a group and you've thought about a particular issue. That's really helpful. The ones that are a bit less useful is where it's just a stock standard letter that dozens and dozens or hundreds of people have signed and doesn't really tell me anything new. It's just a straight up petition, effectively. So this is not a vote. And it's about me getting information. It's about the EPA receiving information. And that information can be brought together collectively really effectively. But I think just a straight up petition, perhaps a little bit less useful in terms of this process. It's not to say don't do it, it's just perhaps worthwhile noting. I've got a lot on this slide, and I'll just kind of work through it just slowly, just bit by bit. I'm
aware that your time was short.
I'm good. I'm good for 5 or 6 minutes, and yeah, it's good. I've only got one more slide, I think, after this, but I do want to just spend a bit of time on this because this is sort of the really meaty bit in some respects. So 7-day comment, short submissions are great. That's not to say that in the PER process or the ARI, where there's a public review process, need to have long and complex submissions. But here are the sort of things that you might want to kind of bear in mind. And this is not exhaustive. This is just me sitting around having a bit of a think about the things that I've seen that are really useful. The first is where your submission, if possible, can be organised around the EPA's factors. So you've been provided that. So if your submission can somehow be organised under those headings or somehow address those, that's really helpful. It just makes things a lot easier straight off the bat. But the second thing is to to engage directly with the proponent's environmental review document. So where there's an environmental review document that you've had time to read, if you can go in there and be very specific about the areas that you're concerned about or critiquing, that's really helpful. And again, it's not quite so helpful if you just sort of say, I don't like the project. It's really helpful if you can give me just a little bit more. And everybody's time poor, and I know this is often being done in a voluntary capacity and so forth, but really helpful if you can just give me a little bit more information there. Can you be kind of specific where possible about what exactly it is that you're concerned about? So thinking again about the Urban Bushland Council and friends groups and so on, your local knowledge is just gold, so use it. Tell us about species that might be represented in the areas that you're concerned about, around fauna matters, around cumulative impacts and so forth. It doesn't need to be couched in a scientific language. It can just be couched in a lay language, but express your concerns, express your express, I suppose, an appreciation or an understanding of the matters at hand and where there might be shortcomings in what the proponent's doing. If you can offer a critical analysis, great, but not everybody can, and that's fine. So speaking from the heart is absolutely fine. If you're able to provide knowledge that's not captured in the environmental review document, where the proponent and their consultants have completely overlooked an area, it's really, really valuable, really important, because again, it gives us the opportunity to go back and try and fill that hole, and we require the proponent to respond to those questions in a response to submissions document. You might think, oh gee, there's some really good alternatives. There's some other ways this proponent could approach this particular project. So we kind of have to assess what's in front of us. But you can still make some suggestions and say, you know what, they could probably shift their development envelope or reduce their clearing by doing these things. You might have some bright ideas about what that looks like. And I think the other thing is, if you could be, well, I don't expect you to necessarily know this, but there are things the EPA can't consider. So we don't do social impact assessments, for argument's sake. We don't do economic development assessments. We don't try to weigh up jobs versus the environment or social housing versus the environment. We're very much focused on the biological and physical environment. So it's really important to sort of understand that we can't do those other things. Government can take those other things into consideration, but we're more constrained. So it's just worthwhile understanding what we are and what we aren't. And again, submissions don't need to be long. They don't need to be 10, 15, 20 pages long. They can be quite succinct and hard-hitting, and in fact some of the very best submissions are really direct and to the point. So in fact being direct is incredibly helpful. So I think this is, this is kind of the key ingredients, I suppose, that I wanted to cover off. I mean, it probably goes without saying, I wouldn't be here if I didn't think that public engagement was not important in the EIA process. The more the merrier, the more the better the outcomes for the assessment process. And I guess I just wanted to come along to something like this and say, we do engage with your submission. So I think there's always a concern when you write a submission that it goes into a black box and nobody ever has a look at it. Well, rest assured that certainly the 7-day comment stuff all comes across my desk. I get the whole package and I take the time to have a look. With the PER process, sometimes we get thousands of submissions. So there is a departmental team that does try and synthesise those, but they do engage with them. And the EPA asks a lot of questions in its meetings about public submissions and what came in, what was being raised and so forth. So really important. The other thing to say is that often the public submissions are not just about the impact assessment that's in front of us, the assessment that we're trying to take care of at that particular moment in time. Often they raise really big environmental policy or protection questions about a particular species or about other matters. Think subterranean fauna. 20 years ago, nobody even thought about subterranean fauna until it emerged during an impact assessment process. And now it's kind of front of mind for most proponents that subterranean fauna is a really, really significant issue and one that proponents must be mindful of and must explicitly address. I guess the last thing that I'd say is that talking to colleagues, previous chairs, but also colleagues in the department, the quality, depth and rigour around submissions is definitely rising. And I think it's thanks to things like this. It's thanks to some of the workshops that CCWA, for example, run and so forth. So what we're clearly seeing is better and better submissions coming in, and I think without doubt what that's leading to is better impact assessments, but also a better knowledge of local environmental context and the outcomes that we're seeking. So, Christine,
Okay.
I've got a few minutes too.
Right, okay, so good.